I was about 11 or 12 years old when I ran away from home. I don't remember the circumstances. I don't remember what the disagreement was, but I remember having some sort of argument with my parents and not wanting to be under their roof any longer. So I got on my bike and I cycled over to my grandmother's farm, which was about a mile and a half away. I'd never done this before. I'd usually visited my grandmother with my parents or with the rest of the family, but I'd never gone there on my own. Now, I walked into her house and she was at her usual spot at the dining room table and reading, watching the birds out the window, which she spent most of her day doing. I do remember that she got a phone call while I was sitting at the table. And although I didn't hear the other end of the conversation, of course, she just said things like, yes, and that was about it. Of course, later I realized that this was either my dad or my mom calling to see if I was indeed there. It didn't take long and my dad's truck pulled up in front of the house. And I was terrified. I was terrified. I thought I was in deep trouble because, well, I'd run away from home. And again, I don't remember all the circumstances, but I do remember this. I remember my dad walking in and greeting my grandmother, not saying much more, but just saying it's time to go to me. And he lifted my bike into the back of the truck and we rode home. We didn't say anything in the truck, as all I recall. And in fact, when we got home, I didn't hear or say anything else about the situation. In fact, I wasn't in trouble. I didn't get scolded. Nothing else was said. But I got home and there was a big meal. Dinner was there. And all was right with the world. And I sat down and had my regular meal with the family. And everything was okay. Home. That's what we're going to look at in this message that I have today. What does home really look like? Have you ever want to run away from home? We're going to take a look at what home really means. Coming home, finding home. And we're going to look at the familiar parable of the prodigal son. And that story is going to help us with this. It was a time where Jesus and the disciples were ministering to people. Jesus was healing people and preaching. And the disciples were there. And it was shortly before they entered Jerusalem. It was not long before Jesus would be entrapped and the crucifixion would follow, of course. So the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the religious leaders of the day, were outraged by this. And they said, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. But really, they were looking for an excuse to get rid of Jesus. This was close to them entrapping him. They wanted Jesus gone. Of course, Jesus knew this. But how does Jesus respond to them and everyone around? What does he do? He tells stories. The lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, the prodigal son. So I'll be reading this story from the New Revised Standard Version, Luke 15, starting at verse 11. Then Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there, he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? And here I am dying of hunger. I will get up, go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. And then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." There are many things that we can learn from this parable, the story of the lost son. But what I'd like us to take away this morning is all about home, coming home, finding home. What is home? What is your definition of home? Is it your house full of family and friends? Is it going back to the town or city or country where you were born and raised? Is it simply being around the people who are nearest and dearest to your heart? Maybe you've watched some of the coming home videos online. You know the ones, the returning servicemen and women surprising their child or parent, spouse, or even surprising their dog. The videos of homecoming that make you reach for a tissue or two. I'm sure you've all seen some of them. Coming home, leaving home, finding home. What can the story of the prodigal son teach us about home? Well, let me start by telling you about Henry. Henry Nouwen was a Dutch Catholic priest, professor, writer, and theologian. I was first introduced to his writings in college when, in one of my classes, we studied the book The Wounded Healer. Henry died in 1996. The last 10 years of his life were spent right here in Ontario. He lived and worked at the L'Arche Daybreak community in Richmond Hill. You may know that L'Arche was founded by Jean Vanier, who died recently. It's a community where people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are cared for in a family setting. Well, in the mid-1980s, Henry Nouwen encountered Rembrandt's painting, The Prodigal Son, in St. Petersburg, Russia. He was so captivated by the work of art that he requested several hours alone with the painting. From that encounter and his reflections over the following years, he wrote his most well-known book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, a story of homecoming. So just as Henry was inspired by Rembrandt's painting, I have been inspired by Henry's book. Maybe you have as well if you've read this book. Writings full of doubts, insecurities, but also aha moments, moments of grace and love. There are many segments of the book that I could share with you, but I'll stay with just one. The few lines that I underlined and highlighted when I first read them, and here they are. Leaving home is living as though I do not yet have a home and must look far and wide to find one. Home is the center of my being, where I can hear the voice that says, "You are my beloved. On you my favor rests." The same voice that gave life to Adam and spoke to Jesus. The same voice that speaks to all the children of God and sets them free to live in the midst of a dark world while remaining in the light. I have heard that voice. It has spoken to me in the past and continues to speak to me now. It is the never-interrupted voice of love, speaking from eternity and giving life and love wherever it is heard. When I hear that voice, I know that I am home with God and have nothing to fear. Henry continues to write, as the beloved, I can confront, console, admonish, and encourage without fear of rejection or need for affirmation. As the beloved, I can suffer persecution without desire for revenge and receive praise without using it as proof of my goodness. As the beloved, I can be tortured and killed without ever having to doubt that the love that is given to me is stronger than death. As the beloved, I am free to live and give life. That voice of love, hearing it in the center of your being, helping you realize that you are home. This love is home. But what do we do with that? Do we listen for that voice? How do we truly hear that voice? If you're like me, you listen to other voices. There are many other voices, voices that are loud, full of promises, and very seductive. These voices say, go out and prove that you are worth something. Soon after Jesus had heard the voice calling him the beloved, he was led to the desert to hear those other voices. They told him to prove that he was worth love in being successful, popular, and powerful. Have you heard those voices? I have. I'm sure you have as well. They're always there. Always there. They reach into those inner places where we question our goodness and doubt our self-worth. They suggest that you or I are not going to be loved without having earned it through determined efforts and hard work. They want us to prove to ourselves and to others that we are worth being loved. And they keep pushing us to do everything possible to gain acceptance. I leave home. You leave home. Every time we lose faith in the voice that calls us the beloved and choose to follow the voices that offer all kinds of other ways to win the love that we so much desire. It's easy to do. Follow the other voices, believe the lies, leave home. And I really think this was one of the messages Jesus was trying to convey in the parable of the prodigal. Losing faith in the voice that is love. Isn't it true that you and I still often live as though God's love is conditional and home is a place we're not yet fully sure of? In his book, Henry Nouwen says Rembrandt's painting just as easily could have been called The Welcome by the Compassionate Father. He points out that in the painting, the Father's hands are the true center point. The light and the eyes of others focus on those hands. The left hand is masculine while the right hand is more feminine. So the character is mother as well as father, welcoming, holding, and caressing the son. The painting is about the father's love for both of his sons. Henry writes, many people live with feelings that they are not worthy of love, or they wonder whether others truly love them. And maybe that's you. Maybe it's been you, maybe it's still you. Sometimes it's me. The father of the prodigal son, though, invites us into a love that really is our true home. How do we fully experience that love, that home? It's easy to say the words or to hear the words, and not all of us will have the aha moment or the epiphany that Henry Nouwen writes about. But I've discovered that when I live out that same kind of accepting, non-judgmental, unconditional love portrayed for us by the father of the prodigal, or live it as best that I know how, it comes back to me. And it will come back to you too if you live that out as best you know how. It creates that secure, safe, loving place for others to enter in. For the people in our lives, for those who cross our path, for the marginalized in our community, for the person who comes through those doors for the first time on a Sunday morning, if we show that love, it just might start looking like home for all of them. But not just for them, for us as well. In all his discussions and study of the painting and Jesus' parable of the prodigal, what struck Henry Nouwen like a thunderbolt, as he describes it, were these words from a colleague. Whether you are the younger son or the elder son, you are called to become the Father. To fully embrace the knowledge that we are the beloved, and then to love in the same way, throwing down the red carpet welcome mat, throwing on the best clothes, throwing the best party, and throwing our arms around each other with a welcome home kiss. I would say to you, welcome home. And if you're not quite there, come home. Don't believe the lies that you have to prove yourself, or that there's something that you have to do to earn the love. You are the beloved of God. You don't have to change a thing. You are loved completely and unconditionally. And if you need to hear that again tomorrow or next week or next month, find someone who will tell you that. Maybe it's someone in this congregation. Maybe it's someone who's a little further along their journey than you are. Maybe it's someone that can help you heal and welcome you home into God's unfailing love, to remind you that that is home. And as spiritual teacher Ram Dass says, we are all just walking each other home. Let's do that as best we know how, and be Jesus' hands and feet extended in a welcome home. Thanks be to God.